World Events, for those of you who don't know, is just over 24 years old. We have 120 staff, a number of offices around the world, and we are ranked in the top 2 in the UK, and we're very much event specialists. We quite pride ourselves, we won lots of awards. I won't dwell on those, you'd be glad to see. And we're currently the Eventier Agency of the Year. The reason really for showing this is that our mission, and this is really what we believe is very important as a business, is that events should be there to meet business objectives and motivate audience in doing that. And that's very much at the core of what we'll be talking about in the next few minutes or so. So measuring return on investment or return on objectives, and there is a big distinction there. Return on investment is very much around the final percentage based on all of the numbers, the process that you go through to evaluate those final figures. Whereas return on objectives is very much meeting and setting out to achieve the key objectives that you set along the way to get to those numbers. And they in themselves can be a very, very powerful way to demonstrate that an event has worked. So let's look at some of the reasons why organisations run events. Now, these are not an exhaustive list by any means, but staff engagement, particularly in today's world, increasingly important that employers get out there, talk to their staff, explain to them what their business strategy is, how they're facing the current economic climate, and what their plans are for the future, and how those employees can play their role in helping the organisation to move forward. Product service launches, brand awareness for consumer events and loyalty, but also user groups in the IT space and knowledge share in terms of best practice across a whole manner of different events and organisations. So what do organisations want to get from those events? Well, obviously they want the strategy to be implemented. The senior management have devised the strategy for the business. They need the employees to be engaged, to understand what it is, and to go out and deliver. But at the same time, and examples of that are beginning to come back as the employer market looks a little bit stronger. Staff retention is very, very important. Motivating staff in difficult times is very important. But also change management. No business can stay still for very long these days. Change management, making your employees understand why the organisation's changing, what it has to do to adapt to today's marketplace is something that really happens probably in most businesses as they re-engineer themselves on a very regular basis. One of the key questions that anybody running an event should ask is, will the event result in attendees doing something differently and changing their behaviour as a result of attending the event? Well, if the answer is no, then the role of an event should seriously be challenged. If assuming it is not, then we'll obviously continue and move forward. But I think it's very, very important to hang on to that. The role of an event is such that an event must result in attendees doing something differently and changing their behaviour. So what should every event do? Well, it should obviously be aiming to deliver a return on investment or, as I was discussing, a return on objectives. So why do we measure it? What's the point? Well, first of all, it's a benchmark to other marketing activity. Now, from my background in the advertising world, there used to be all forms of econometric modelling, means to evaluate the success of advertising, to isolate it from other forms of communication and marketing that might have taken place. It was a very, very intensive process. You needed a number of very intellectual people to actually work it all out for you and to arrive at that final figure. It was very complex, but at the end of the day, they can do it. Other forms of marketing can also do it, so events, we need to be able to do it as well. But it's also a benchmark for organisations to other forms of expenditure. So for a company, is it a case of building a new staff canteen, or do they actually run the company conference or take everybody away to talk to them about the business and what they need those people to do within their organisations? It's also important, and I find this on a very regular basis out there talking to people, that whoever it is within the organisation, they can justify the event budget to their stakeholders. So, for example, the head of events can go to the finance director, or the finance director can go to the chief exec or the board and say, look, this is why we need to spend events, this is what it does for us, this is the return it gives to our business. Sorry, interesting sounds coming from the ceiling up there. It's also there to encourage greater expenditure on events, because if we can prove that it works and prove that the business is getting a return and it's getting a return on its objectives, then it's the means by which we can encourage further and additional expenditure. But the other key thing, as we'll look at, is it ensures better event planning. Even if you go out to measure it and work to that process, you actually get a better run event. So let's just look at a definition of the purpose of events and why they're there. To persuade, educate, empower participants to do something which adds value to stakeholders at the lowest possible cost. Now that lowest possible cost, there are means by which you shouldn't go any lower, and I'll give you a little example of that in a moment. The means to measure it, and this is a methodology that many of you may have heard of or have read about or be familiar with, but there's a methodology that we adopt that's known as the Phillips ROI model. It's been refined over a 20-year period. There's thousands of ROI studies that have been conducted every year. There's case studies that you can acquire or books that you can look at that support the model and demonstrate how it works. But for me, it's very important that it's been used by the likes of PwC, by HP, Coca-Cola, large multinational global organizations who actually know and manage their budgets carefully. They recognize this as the means to be able to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of their events. So how does it work? Well, there's a chain of impact in terms of how you can go about measuring your event. Now, the first thing you need is a good learning environment. And as I said, you don't necessarily want to go for completely the lowest cost option. I mean, here we've got two potential venues. Quite clearly, the one on the left is going to be the lower cost one, but is it really appropriate for an audience of C-level managers from within an organization to actually encourage them to be able to learn? Perhaps not. Is the venue on the right appropriate? Again, perhaps not. It's maybe over the top. But you need to find something appropriate. So lowest cost is within reason and relative to the audience that you are talking to at your event. So moving on from the actual learning environment, delegates need to learn and remember. They then need to be able to use what they've learnt, and their stakeholders in that organization need to benefit from what they actually do as a result of that learnings. And then the benefits that are converted into money for ROI calculation purposes. So just to look at that a little bit further, the methodology has a sort of pyramid on 5 levels. The bottom level is reaction and satisfaction, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. The next level is about learning, and here it's very much about asking people in terms of your stakeholders for your event, what are the key learning objectives? What do we want the delegates to learn from this event that they can take forward with them into the organization and do something differently? Because if they do something differently, they need to apply that by way of application into their daily roles. Now, if they make that application, then obviously there should be a business impact or a financial impact to the organization, which will result in one's ability to be able to arrive at the financial amount and then looking at the costs of the event to work out the return on investment. Now, I'm going to take you through that a little bit slower because I appreciate I went that through quite quickly. So we'll go through it in the stages and we'll look at the questions at each level in a little bit more detail.